I want you to imagine this scene. Inside the White House, oil executives sit across from the most powerful man on earth. Chevron, Exxon Mobil, ConocoPhillips, and the promise on the table is not subtle. Total safety, total security. A country has just been broken open. Its leader arrested. Its oil, the largest reserves on the planet, suddenly back in play. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and what you're watching unfold is not just about Venezuela. It's about how power works in the modern world. How governments clear the path and corporations follow. How war, law, and energy quietly negotiate the future of global order. Trump says $100 billion will flow in, not taxpayer money, corporate money protected by the state. That single sentence should make you pause. If this kind of analysis helps you see the world more clearly, stay with me. Because what looks like opportunity on the surface hides a far more complex mechanism underneath. And to understand it, we need to step back and ask a more fundamental question. What is really being sold here? To understand this moment, we have to strip away the rhetoric and look at the structure. The story being told is simple. Venezuela has fallen. Its oil industry is broken. And American companies are being invited back in under American protection. But beneath that simplicity lies the real question. What problem is this plan actually trying to solve? For Venezuela, the issue is obvious. Decades of nationalization, aging infrastructure, and collapsing investment have hollowed out what was once a booming oil powerhouse. Production fell, capital fled, expertise disappeared. For the United States, the motivation is different. Global oil markets are already flooded, prices are soft, gas is cheaper than last year. This is not about scarcity. It's about control. Control over supply, control over legal frameworks, control over who extracts value and who guarantees the risk. Trump frames this as a reset, a clean slate, an even plate, but resets are never clean. And history never forgets. To see why, we need to look backward at how Venezuela got here in the first place. To understand Venezuela's present, we have to revisit a familiar cycle, one that has played out across the developing world for decades. In the late 1992s and early 2000s, Venezuela's oil industry was thriving. Foreign capital flowed in, production surged, oil revenues powered the state. For a time, it worked. Then came the turn. Under Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan government reasserted control over oil as a matter of sovereignty. Assets were nationalized, contracts rewritten. Foreign firms like Exxon Mobil and ConocoPhillips walked away or were forced out, leaving behind unresolved claims worth billions. The logic was political, not irrational. Oil was national wealth, and the state wanted command of its destiny. But oil is not just a resource, it is a system. It requires constant capital, technology, maintenance, and trust. When investment dried up, infrastructure aged. When expertise left, output collapsed. And when global markets moved on, Venezuela was left behind. What followed was not a single failure, but a slow erosion year after year, pipeline by pipeline. This is the wreckage Trump is now pointing to. And it sets the stage for the first real shock in this story, the moment when politics, markets, and force collide. The first shock comes not quietly, but decisively. Maduro is arrested, power changes hands, and suddenly what was uninvestable is declared open for business. Within days, oil executives are flown to Washington. The message is blunt. Venezuela's collapse is no longer a warning, it's an opening. Trump tells them production will surge, fast. He promises protection not just from chaos, but from history itself. Total safety, total security. That phrase matters because oil companies don't fear geology, they fear courts. Expropriation, contracts that vanish with the next election. Trump isn't selling oil, he's selling certainty enforced by American power. Then comes the legal strike. An executive order shields Venezuelan oil revenues held in U.S. accounts. Courts are sidelined, creditors paused, money is frozen and redirected toward a future defined in Washington. It's a dramatic move and a revealing one. If you're finding yourself uneasy, that's the point. These moments shape the global system more than speeches ever do. Stay with me because this crisis is not the story, it's the signal. What follows is the mechanism behind it all, the quiet logic that makes this possible in the first place. Here is the part most people miss. Oil does not move because it exists. It moves because rules allow it to. What Trump is offering is not drilling rights. It is a framework, a system where risk is absorbed by power and profit is released to capital. The state guarantees security, corporations supply money. Together, they rebuild an industry on their terms. This is why $100 billion is even being discussed, not because Venezuela is suddenly safe, but because safety is being manufactured. Legal uncertainty is the real enemy here. Exxon CEO says it plainly. Today, Venezuela is uninvestable. Not because the oil is bad, but because the rules are. Change the rules, and capital follows. And notice what disappears in this framing. Past losses, national sovereignty, local consent. Trump calls it an even plate, but it's not even. It's selective amnesia enforced by leverage. Creditors are told to wait, courts are told to stand down, history is told to move on. This is how modern power operates, not through conquest alone, but through systems that decide whose risks matter and whose don't. And once that system locks in, the second shock arrives. The second shock is quieter and more dangerous. It comes when optimism meets reality. Executives speak of speed, of doubling output, of restoring what was lost. But beneath the confidence is hesitation. Exxon says it clearly. Without significant changes, nothing moves. ConocoPhillips speaks of opportunity, but also of $12 billion still unpaid. This is the fracture line. Because rebuilding an oil state is not like flipping a switch. Infrastructure is corroded, skilled labor is gone, trust has evaporated, and globally, oil is no longer scarce. There is surplus. Prices are soft. The urgency Trump projects does not exist in the market. Here is the tension. Political power wants results fast. Capital moves slowly, and only when conditions are right. Promises of security collide with balance sheets. Legal guarantees collide with memories of nationalization. The state says, trust us. The market asks, for how long? History shows what happens when this gap widens. Investment stalls, expectations break, and the grand vision begins to wobble. This is the moment where big geopolitical plans stop being abstract and start touching real lives. Because when systems stall, it's not executives who absorb the shock. It's people, and that's where this story turns next. If you are an ordinary Venezuelan, this is where the story feels very different. You are not thinking in billions. You are thinking in days. Days without reliable electricity, days without stable work, days where the future feels permanently postponed. When politicians talk about oil returning, they speak in abstractions. But for you, oil is not a geopolitical asset. It is whether hospitals function, whether salaries arrive, whether your children stay or leave. You are told help is coming. That investment will fix everything. That stability will return once the pipelines flow again. But you've heard this before, first from the state, then from foreign partners, now from a distant superpower promising protection, not participation. This is the cruel paradox. Oil wealth is supposed to lift societies, yet time and again it bypasses the very people standing on it. Decisions are made in Washington boardrooms while daily life remains fragile at home. If this analysis resonates with you, pause for a moment, share it, because these stories only change when people understand the systems shaping them. And to truly grasp what's at stake, we need to zoom out beyond Venezuela to the global consequences now unfolding. When Venezuela's oil is pulled back into the global system, it doesn't just affect one country, it sends ripples outward. Energy markets are already crowded. There is no shortage of supply. So when Trump talks about extracting oil like few people have seen, he is really talking about leverage, the ability to influence prices, flows, and competitors. Lower prices benefit American consumers. They also pressure rivals. This is where geopolitics enters quietly. Control over Venezuelan oil means influence over Latin America's energy map. It shifts bargaining power away from alternative partners and back toward Washington. It signals that access to resources still runs through political alignment, not just markets. But history offers a warning. Foreign intervention has boosted oil output before temporarily. Just as often, it has produced instability, backlash, and reversal. Systems imposed from outside rarely settle cleanly. And there is another audience watching closely. Other resource-rich nations are taking notes. They are learning what happens when sovereignty weakens and when protection comes with conditions. This moment is not isolated. It is part of a broader pattern reshaping global order where power, capital, and security merge. And that raises the final, unavoidable question. What happens next? When we look ahead, three futures begin to take shape, not predictions, but pathways. The first is the optimistic scenario. Legal reforms hold, security guarantees persist, capital arrives slowly but steadily. Oil production rises not explosively, but enough to stabilize the state. Venezuela re-enters the global system as a managed energy producer. The scars remain, but the collapse stops. This outcome depends on something fragile: consistency. A legal order that survives elections. A security promise that does not fade. History suggests how rare that is. The second scenario is more likely. Investment comes selectively. Production increases unevenly. Profits are extracted faster than institutions are rebuilt. Oil flows, but the broader economy lags. Venezuela becomes functional, not transformed. Stability without renewal. And then there is the third path. Political shifts return. Guarantees weaken. Old fears resurface. Capital hesitates or exits. Infrastructure decays again. Another cycle begins, slightly poorer, slightly more cynical than before. This is the systemic truth. Resource wealth does not determine outcomes. Governance does. Rules do. Trust does. Oil can buy time. It cannot buy legitimacy. And that insight brings us to the final reflection, the one that matters most. What we are witnessing in Venezuela is not simply the return of oil companies. It is the return of an old idea that power can manufacture stability and that markets will follow. Sometimes that idea works. Often it doesn't. Trump's promise of total safety reveals something fundamental about our era. In a world flooded with capital and resources, what truly holds value is protection, legal certainty, the ability to erase risk by force, by decree, by influence. But systems built this way are brittle. They depend on continuity and power, not consent, on enforcement, not trust. And history shows us how quickly those systems fracture when the guarantees disappear. For Venezuela, the oil may flow again. For investors, profits may return. For consumers, prices may dip. But the deeper question remains unresolved. Who owns the future of a country, its people, or the forces that can secure its resources? If this analysis helped you see that question more clearly, stay with me, share this conversation. Because the next chapter of global power will be written not just in oil fields, but in how we decide what stability really means. And that story is only just beginning.